So welcome everyone. Thank you for logging on to this evening's program. My name is Matt Schumann. I am a programming librarian here at Cary Library. Before we begin, please let me know in the chat if there's any technical difficulties, and I can try to resolve them. If you have any questions, please submit them via the Q&A, or you can raise your hand and I'll enable you to be able to unmute your mic and talk. I'd also like to thank the generous donors to the Cary Library Foundation for helping make tonight's program possible. So now on to introducing tonight's speaker. David Kalivas is a senior adjunct professor at the University of Massachusetts Lowell. His research interests are in world history and Eurasian studies. He holds an AB from Suffolk University, an MA from the University of Connecticut at Storrs, and a Ph.D. from Northeastern University. So now please welcome Professor David Kalivas.
Well, thank you for that introduction, Matthew. Thank you very much. And welcome everyone. It's I'd like to say a pleasure to see you, but you're not there. So it's a pleasure to see you in some capacity. And thank you for coming tonight to this session. Before I begin the talk proper, and the talk is really historical contextualization of the Ukrainian-Russian war. But before I begin, I really want to take a moment and just reflect for all of us that the topic that we're discussing tonight, while it is filled with historical context and we are going to look at the past as a way of understanding the present, we should be mindful, and I want to be mindful, that there is a war going on since last February. Thousands of lives have been lost. Cities in Ukraine have been destroyed, and Ukrainian infrastructure wiped out in many parts of the country. And this loss of life and this destruction of cities and the loss of life on all sides, of course, but really makes us mindful that this is a horrible thing happening. And in fact, the savagery that we're hearing being committed by Russian troops is also horrifying on top of the carnage of war. So I simply wanted to, take a moment to reflect that right now this is going on, and Ukrainians are defending their homeland, and Ukrainians are defending their very lives. So we should just give some reflection to that and just make note of that. So now I would like to begin the talk proper. But as we begin the talk, I think it's also very important for us to reflect on the importance and the value of historical understanding. That often the importance of history is not engaged fully. And, when we make policy in our societies, when policymakers decide that they're going to do something, they don't always engage the historical context to look for the lessons of the past. And I think for us, understanding the conflict, the war, the Russian invasion of Ukraine is an opportunity for us to really appreciate the power of historical understanding, to weed out what is being discussed and what is being raised and what is being acted upon in the present. And I'm hoping that we can all realize the tool that history has for us and our society, and the undervaluedness sometimes of historical understanding, and the lack of value can be dangerous for society. And I think this is true of what's playing out in Ukraine right now. And so what I want to start to do is put some slides up and start the program, where we'll try and do some historical contextualization for understanding the war. So historical context for the Russo-Ukrainian War, 2014 to the present. And I put 2014 because while Putin's Russia invaded Ukraine in February of 2022, This war really begins in 2014 with the Russian occupation and subsequent annexation of Crimea, and the tensions that began, and with then the creation of the so-called People's Republics of the Donbass region, the Luhansk and Donetsk People's Republics, and the recognition of those People's Republics in eastern, southeastern Ukraine by Putin's regime, and the war that went on from 2014 until 2022, prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine proper, in these areas of eastern Ukraine, where thousands of people were killed. And so there was fighting, and there was tension, and there was occupation of Ukrainian territory by the Russians beginning in 2014. And that's why I put this date back to 2014. Also, as we begin, I think it's important for us to have information and evidence and historical perspective, obviously. And I'm just going to share several of these authors. Anything by, in the center, The Gates of Europe, A History of Ukraine. Anything by Serhiy Plokhy from Harvard University is a must-read. He is the historian in this country of Ukraine, and he has written widely on Russian history as well. And he is an author, and particularly this book, The Gates of Europe, to learn more in terms of all the details of Ukrainian history. This is a good book, The Gates of Europe, to start with. Also, Timothy Snyder on the left of your screen has written, he's a Ukrainian historian, a Polish historian as well, but a historian of Eastern Europe. And his book, The Bloodlands, Europe Between Hitler and Stalin, very powerful. And he's also done a number of lectures. Timothy Snyder has from Yale University. And in fact, his course on the history of Ukraine, I believe right now is in the process in New Haven, and it's being made public weekly on YouTube. So you could do a search for him for a very detailed course on the history of Ukraine. Anne Applebaum has written on Eastern Europe, and this book on the Red Famine, Stalin's War in the Ukraine, is very powerful and helps really establish a foundation for understanding the relationships between modern Soviet Union, modern Russia as it would come to be, and Ukraine, and what happens during the terror famine of 1932-33, and we'll talk about that as we move on. Also, Paul Dianeri, in terms of a great book on policy issues between Ukraine and Russia. So I just wanted to put these sources before you, because I think it's important for us to have source materials, and otherwise we don't have the evidence we need. So moving forward now, the map you see before you, of course, is a map of Eastern Europe, Central Eastern Europe, and stretching into Russia. You see the Ukraine, you see Ukraine in the center, and we have the Russified version of Kiev, but really the Ukrainian version is Kyiv, and people use it interchangeably, but at this point we really should be thinking about how the Ukrainians refer to their capital, and it's Kyiv. But in this map, we see the countries, we see modern day nation states. But what we have to think about, if we're going to go back in time, and we really need to go back in time, we have to think about, and I don't know if you can see hopefully you can see my cursor. Here's the Black Sea, Sea of Azov. Ukraine is right around here. Right around here. Russia over here. Okay. So when we look at this, what we see is, of course, Eurasia, and from where we see China over here in the east, and what we see is the steppe lands. Is my point. If you look at the geography of Eurasia, all the way across, migrations and peoples have been moving across these steppe lands right into Eastern Europe for thousands of years. And I want to point that out as we move forward, because this region of Ukraine, as we call it today, was and remains at a crossroads for interactions and interchange of peoples and cultures and languages. And that has been going on for a long time. And it's important to realize that for purposes of understanding the war. Why, you ask, is it important? Well, I think it's important because right now, when Russia invaded the Ukraine, when it invades Ukraine, it does so under the guise of two reasons. One is it has had enough of NATO's expansion, and it has was not disposed towards seeing a Ukraine in NATO, and it had been, according to Putin at the time, warning the West that they should not be expanding NATO into Eastern Europe, and that they to do so would be seen as a threat to Russia, and that the continual Western lean of Ukraine was seen as intolerable by Putin, and he had had enough. That's one generalized justification. But the other is that the Russians under Putin, and they have said this, don't see Ukrainian national identity as real, as separate from Russia. That really Ukraine is and has always been part of Russia, and that Putin was going to correct a mistake that had occurred when Ukraine became independent in 1991 at the collapse of the Soviet Union, and bring it back into the fold. And that's the kind of rhetoric that we were hearing out of Moscow after the invasion, and even before. And so to realize that that's just not true, we need to go back in time a bit. And when we go back in time, we realize that long before there was a Russia, long before there was a Moscow, and really modern Russia has its origins in the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, beginning in the 13th century, and as it takes shape in the 17th century with the emergence of the Romanov dynasty in 1613, 1615. However, Ukrainian identity stems back to Rus, to this territory that you can see that's referred to on the map as Kievan Rus. Now, this specific phrase, or Kievan Rus, this specific phrase emerges much later in time, but Rus has origins in Scandinavian peoples who come down from Scandinavia, the Vikings, and settle this area. And again, I don't have time to go into a detailed history here, but what I want you to realize is that going back into the 9th and 10th centuries, let that sink in a minute. The 800s and 900s, Vikings, Norsemen, people from Scandinavia, will begin to go down the rivers, the Volga and the Dnieper in Ukraine, and go down these rivers on their way looking for wealth. The Vikings were known for raiding and trading. And one of the goals, of course, for Viking raiders and traders as they navigated the river systems through what is today Ukraine, through Rus, the Rusland would become the Ruslands. The Dnieper would take you all the way into then the Black Sea, and the end point would be Byzantium, the Roman Empire, whose capital at that time was in Constantinople, current day Istanbul. And so the Vikings will intermingle with the Slavic peoples that had been settling there for centuries, but they also would come down and eventually switch from raiding and trading and begin to settle and begin to become an elite who by the 9th century and 10th centuries, let's get to the 10th century, by the late 10th century, you will see the emergence of a state in Kiev, and under the leadership of Volodymyr. And Volodymyr in the late 10th century, and his son Yaroslav in the early 11th century, they will create a dynasty and that will establish what you see here, Kievan Rus, is the largest state in Europe. And Yaroslav will marry his daughters off to all the different princes and kings in Western Europe and Eastern Europe, and will make connections, diplomatic connections through marriage. And it is, I know it's hard to believe now, but this is the most significant state outside, north of the Roman Empire, the Byzantine Empire, in the 10th and early 11th centuries. And it is very much, of course, influenced by Scandinavian language and culture. And what will emerge here is very significant for purposes of understanding the development of Ukrainian national identity, because those are the roots in what we see as Kievan Rus for Ukrainian identity. As I said, Moscow has not emerged yet at all. Now, this state will trade heavily and significantly. In fact, it's important to realize Volodymyr, and I'm going to talk more about who he is. Volodymyr will marry one of the daughters of the Byzantine Emperor, Basil II, establishing a dynastic relationship, but also establishing a strong dynastic relationship through marriage for purposes of trade and wealth. And as a result, eventually in the 10th century, the two monks, Cyril and Methodius, will come out of the Byzantine Empire and begin to introduce they'll begin to Christianize. In fact, they'll begin to introduce Christianity into Rus, and Christianity will eventually spread into what is today the Ukraine and parts of what is today Russia. And also they will introduce a written script using the Greek language. And that is why, if you look at Ukrainian and if you look at Russian, a lot of the letters in the script has, if you know Greek, there's a familiarity with Greek because it comes out of the Byzantine Empire as during the 10th and into the 11th centuries. Now, what's important about this is, again, identity. What's emerging here in this part of the world is a significant state with an identity known as Rus, if you would, and with a founder. And the founder is, in Russian today, it's Vladimir. In Ukrainian, it's Volodymyr. And here is a statue of Volodymyr the Great, who establishes the first major dynasty that has longevity and that will become a Christian, a state that will begin to spread Christianity throughout the land, and that is, like all founders, he's a major statue here in Kiev, but there's also a major statue, of him. I was going to go back a slide, but hold on. Yeah, there's also a major statue of him that was built in 2016 in Moscow by Vladimir Putin, right outside the Kremlin wall. A 56-foot statue, huge. And what's important here is that statue in Moscow, huge, was used as a symbol and as a tool to demonstrate the relationship between Russian and Ukrainian identity as being one and the same, as Ukraine being little Russia, and Russia being, of course, the motherland, with its origins in Ukraine. And so I want to show you a little clip, and then we'll talk a bit more about this, of the consecration of this statue in Moscow in 2016. It's a couple of so minutes, and just to get a flavor for what's going on, there'll be a fellow wearing a white headdress. He is Patriarch Alexei, the Patriarch of Moscow, Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, who has lock, stock, and barrel supported this war, has referred to it as a holy war, in sync with Putin's rhetoric, and then you'll see Putin and his Vice President Medvedev. And what's happening is that the statue is being consecrated in Moscow. It is being blessed by the Patriarch and as integral to Russian culture. And of course, Vladimir's name, Vladimir Putin, and as the Russians refer to this fellow, Vladimir the Great, or as Ukrainians, Beludimir, of course, his name during the day and age when he was living was actually some form of Scandinavian language and Scandinavian name. But let's look now to this consecration, and then to a little speech that Putin gave in 2016. And there are subtitles for the speech. Okay, I have to stop share this, then share that. And if this is not coming across, Matthew, you can let me know.
Yep.
So here we are, the statue of Volodymyr the Great in Moscow at the Kremlin Wall. Look at the size of this. This is a significant ceremony. We have the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church, President and Vice President of Russia, and assorted dignitaries. In full ritual mode, with the Church of Russia providing blessing and consecrating this statue. Stop talking so you can feel the moment. And there, of course, is Putin and Medvedev, President and figurehead Vice President. There's the Kremlin Wall, you can see in central Moscow.
Господу помолимся.
Господи Боже Вседержителю, Бог Отец наших, благослови и освети памятник сей в честь святаго равноапостольного великого князя Владимира Крестителя Руси. Ты бо, если иси освящение наше, и Тебе славу воссылаем, Отцу и Сыну и Святому Духу, ныне и присно и во веки веков. Аминь. Благословляется и освящается памятник сей благодатью Святаго Духа, окроплением воды сия священная. Во имя Отца и Сына и Святаго Духа. Аминь.
So what we have here, of course, this huge ceremony, but it represents the unity, of course, of church and state. It represents the imperial legacy in many ways of the imperial Russian Empire from the 18th and 19th century, where church and state was unified, working hand in hand, in sync together. And we're back to that here. Okay, now here's one more. here is a speech in 2016. Now read the subtitles, and then I'm going to read you a little a speech that Putin made in 2014-15 when he occupied Crimea. Right. Can you all see this, Matthew?
No, I think you have to exit back out and
Okay,
share just the, yeah.
let's see. All right. How about now?
Yep, I can see.
Okay, so let's listen to Putin.
Символ единства нашей страны.
Наш князь Владимир навсегда вошел в историю как собиратель и защитник русских земель, как дальновидный политик, созидавший основы сильного, единого, централизованного государства. И сегодня наш долг вместе противостоять современным вызовам и угрозам, опираясь на духовные заветы.
Okay, there we go. I think I'm back. No, hold on.
Yeah, you just gotta share the.
Yeah, go back to
slide.
the slide. Yeah. Okay. Oh, let me go back. All right.
Yep.
So Prince Vladimir, the centralized state, just look at how Putin has co-opted and the Russians have co-opted Ukrainian history. And let me read to you after the occupation annexation of Crimea and the recognition of the People's Republics of Donetsk and Luhansk in the Donbass region, Putin said these in a speech. He said, this is from Putin in 2014-15, our concerns are understandable because we are not simply close neighbors, but as I have said many times already, we are one people. Kiev is the mother of Russian cities. Ancient Rus is our common source, and we cannot live without each other. So keep that in mind, because what's going on here is that in an attempt to eradicate the past in favor of a new past, of a recreated past. And in many ways, this is so Orwellian. The victors write the history, we were told. And in this case, Putin is trying to rewrite the past completely and put it within an imperial Russian model of reclaiming what he is arguing is simply Russian, that Ukrainian identity doesn't exist. And when Putin's armies invaded Ukraine in February 2022, the thought was by the Russian high command and Putin, from what we understand, is that they would sweep over Ukraine. They would find Ukrainians who are really Russians, particularly in the eastern and some of the central provinces, that they would come out in the streets and welcome the Russians as liberators. Well, obviously that didn't happen. Here we are into this bloody war with Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian national identity surging, and the support for the Ukrainian resistance and Ukrainian fight against the invaders at full speed ahead. And there was none of that. And instead of sweeping through, the obverse has happened. And that the Ukrainian armed forces have swept along a 2,000-mile area the Russians out and are now locked in a deadly conflict with Russian forces, and what will happen, we don't know. Yet in as you can see, there was this reality that Putin is trying to create has resulted in such deadly consequences. But it's a reality that has no basis in history. And so we can see from Rus, beginning with Rus, but also what we have to realize is at some point, the Mongols will invade this territory. So I'm going to jump back a little bit here. And just to give us a sense that at some point, Kievan Rus will collapse and will collapse to the Mongol invasions, as would most of Eurasia. And you can just see some arrows here. And I have to move it along because I'm realizing it's probably about 7:30 and I'm only still at the beginning. So let's just move along here. But as we move along, the Mongols will invade. This Kievan Rus state will collapse. The red here is essentially the Mongol Empire. It will become the dominant empire. And mind you, at this point, there's no Russia. I just want to keep that in mind. And eventually, of course, the Mongols will recede. They will, after about 290 years, they will leave. And then we'll see the beginnings of different states. In the 13th century, Moscow will emerge, and the Duchy of Moscow will emerge, and eventually it'll be referred to as the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, and it will actually be the Mongols who give the Grand Duke of Muscovy his ability to reign and to rule as long as he pays tribute to the Mongols. But eventually, we'll see the emergence of different states. There'll be a Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. That all this red area that you can see at that point, the largest state in Europe, and it will. And again, you will see a relationship between the Lithuanians, between Rus, between the Poles, and this state will be have a central role in the history of the region. Again, where was Russia born? Well, not Kievan Rus. Moscow is up here, this top arrow. And that's where we see the emergence of Russia out of the Grand Duchy of Muscovy from the 13th to the 16th centuries, not out of Rus. And jumping along here, of course, eventually in the 17th century, we will see the emergence of the Romanov dynasty and the emergence of what we understand is the Imperial Russia that will collapse with the revolution in 1917. But during that phase of the Imperial Russia, Ukrainian identity will continue to develop. It will no longer have a state system. But by the 19th century, the Russian state will become rather concerned about the emerging Ukrainian identity, so much so that by the 1860s, in the late 19th century, the Imperial Russian state will outlaw Ukrainian language and will attempt to suppress the emergence of Ukrainian identity through literature and histories in the 19th century. By the time we get to moving along to the 20th century, the development of the Soviet Union after the collapse of Imperial Russia during World War I and the Bolshevik Revolution of 1917, we'll see the emergence of the Soviet Union. But between 1917 and 1920, there will be an attempt by Ukrainian nationalists to create an independent Ukrainian state. That fails because of the emergence of the Soviet Union that keeps the Ukraine within the Soviet sphere. But by the time we get to the late 1920s, the early 1930s, the Ukrainian nationalist movement, which had been really consumed by the Soviet state, is still there, is still percolating, and in 1932, Stalin will institute a man-made famine, the Holodomor, and which is death by hunger. And the Holodomor is essentially 1932 to 33, not essentially, but millions of Ukrainians will perish as a result of this man-made famine by Stalin, which is an attempt, not an attempt, it was a powerful terror to completely eradicate and the Ukrainian nationalist movement at the same time as putting Ukraine right in place and making sure it understands it's part of the Soviet Union. And it was designed by Stalin also to gain hard currency for grain exports while people were starving here in the Ukraine of that time. So again, by the time we get to the Soviet Union, all of after World War II, Eastern Europe is completely consumed by the Soviet Union. The red border showing us the Iron Curtain, as coined by Churchill, but the creation of the Warsaw Pact and of the Eastern European countries under the firm grip of Moscow. Well, by the late 80s, that all changes. And by the late 80s, of course, we have a regime in Moscow, the Soviet government, after a period of what was referred to as the Brezhnev years of stagnation, that all of a sudden there emerges in the mid 80s a fresh not young, but middle-aged, a fresh face, Mikhail Gorbachev. And Mikhail Gorbachev comes to power in the mid 80s of a Soviet Union in need of reform, a Soviet Union whose infrastructure is collapsing, whose economy is suffering, who also has to get out of the Afghanistan war, which they were losing, and many thousands of lives. And as Gorbachev comes into power in the 80s, he does so as a reformist, and with the strategy of perestroika, glasnost, openness, reconstruction, openness, and demokratizacija, right? Democratization of the party, of the Communist Party. So he's attempting to reform the Soviet Union, and as he begins to engage the reforms of the Soviet Union, by the time we get to the late 80s, these reforms are filtering throughout Eastern Europe. And there is this openness, this gradual relaxation, this thawing of relations. But let's just move it along, by essentially 1990-91, Eastern Europe has decided that they had had enough. And Gorbachev was not, unlike what happened in 1968 in Czechoslovakia, and unlike what happened in 1956 in Hungary, Gorbachev was not sending the Red Army and its tanks in to crush the reformist movements that began emerging in the Baltic states and in the Eastern European states, the Soviet bloc states. And as those reformist movements evolved and emerged into independence movements, it was the beginning of the end for the Soviet control of Eastern Europe. And by 91, of course, the Soviet Union would collapse. Gorbachev, though, in 1991, attempts to reform. You can see here in these pictures, in Maidan Square here, in the bottom one, in the Ukraine, the movement is not for reform, but for Ukrainian independence. You see the picture here with Yeltsin on a tank with the Russian Federation flag, when the hardliners in Moscow attempted a putsch to reconstitute and reclaim Soviet authority, all of which fails. And by 91, Gorbachev is out. The Soviet Union is gone. The Russian Federation has emerged. There's something called the Commonwealth of Independent States, an attempt to create out of the former Soviet states of Russia, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine, a new Commonwealth of Independent States. But in 1991, Ukrainians don't want any part of it. There is a referendum, unlike the sham referenda that have been taking place in the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic just this week, as a prelude to annexation by Putin. In 1991, there was a referendum, roughly 89 to 90% turnout. And the referendum, as you can see here, by these percentages, is without a doubt solid for independence from Russia. even in the eastern provinces that have much heavier Russian-speaking populations, it was a overwhelming majority, 86, 83, 83%, even in the Crimea, 54%, which was the heaviest in terms of ethnic Russians. But the ethnic Russian population is, of course, heaviest in the East, not so in the West at all. And in the West, it had, of course, histories with Poland and histories with Central and Eastern Europe that was not Russia in its history. But even in the heavily ethnic Russian areas of Ukraine, the vote was clearly for independence. Just keep this in mind. This was a legitimate, observed, and without question by anyone referendum, unlike what's happening today. In the 90s, there were treaties. You can see here the participants, the leaders of the three states, United States, Russia, and Ukraine. In 94, there was the Budapest Memorandum, where Ukraine agreed to give up its nuclear weapons, and back to Russia they went. In 1997, there was the Treaty of Friendship and Cooperation, where Russia agreed to recognize the sovereignty of Ukraine and its independence, and that they would not do anything against it. And during that process of the early 90s, and this is what we hear a lot from Russian diplomats under Putin right now, is that the Americans, Secretary of State Baker, under Bush, the first Bush, prior to the collapse of the Soviet Union, had said that we would not move 1 inch closer in terms of NATO expansion. And it's often mentioned that, you know, NATO, the West had said they would not expand NATO. But what happens is NATO, it does expand. But what happens is that when countries emerge, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, Slovakia, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Bulgaria, and they become independent and sovereign, then they become independent and sovereign. And as we've seen, that means they can make their decisions on their own. And Putin's invasion of the Ukraine was an attempt to stop that westward lean. Instead, Sweden and Finland now are joining NATO, and he's actually expanded NATO, and actually expanded Western and NATO influence, and united Western Europe in a way that was not imaginable before the war. How long that goes on, we'll see. But one of the things is with Ukraine, that the Ukrainians wanted their independence. Their independence was guaranteed by the signatories of the Treaty of Friendship, Russia and the United States, Germany, and what's happening now is a direct correlation to those guarantors of supporting Ukrainian independence in the face of Russian aggression. And what I have here is something that a map that we could go back to late 18th, early 19th century Russia with, where on top it says Ukraina, and on the bottom Novorossiya. And so this is what, of course, initially Putin is trying to recreate, that this is new Russia. These are new Russian lands. And of course, he did it one step further, trying to overtake the entirety of the country. And where we are now, of course, you can see on the eastern area, the shaded, the purple and the orange areas, it shows you the battlegrounds that's ongoing right now. And so, you know, are there peaceful solutions? I don't know what they are. Ukraine's independence and sovereignty and Russia's security concerns have to be met and dealt with. But at the same time, what are Ukraine's security concerns that have been completely trounced upon at this point and completely ignored as this war continues to unfold? And so what I've presented now trying to do so within 45 minutes, is a chronicle, an attempt to give you this broad brushstroke of all that was going on in the area of Ukraine prior to the development of the Grand Duchy of Muscovy, prior to the emergence of Russia, prior to anything that's Russian, and at the same time showing how the modern Russian state, particularly under Vladimir Putin, is attempting to rewrite the past to the point of taking Volodymyr the Great, making him a Russian saint, and consecrating his statue as well in Moscow, and proclaiming the non-existence of Ukrainian identity. So I'll open it up to questions at this point, and hopefully we can have a great discussion. There's a lot that I haven't covered, but again, my attempt was to provide a historical context as a way to have a discussion. And so share whatever you'd like to share, and any questions that you have, and we'll have a great discussion. Unfortunately, we can't open this up to all of us seeing each other, but we can still have a great discussion through the chat. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, David. That was a fascinating overview. I think you did a great job in the 45 minutes that we had. There's a question that was submitted already, and it was, and I'll just repeat, please send your questions via the Q&A, or you can do the raise hand function and I can enable you to be able to talk. So there was a question: when and how did Beludimir the Great become a saint?
So I'll answer that in a sec. I'm trying to, I can't see anything here. Oh, exit, okay. How do I exit? Oh, excuse me, I'm sorry, I'm having
No worries.
I'm having some technical difficulties here. Hold on. Oh God, come on. So I believe he's been a saint for a while, quite frankly. I don't know the actual date of when he became a saint. Yeah, so I'm sorry, I just don't know the actual date. He's been a saint for a while, that I do know. And when the actual date is, I can't answer it, sorry. But what's important here is that Putin, by creating this statue, is really attempting to co-opt a Ukrainian, if you would, figure as Russian. That's the importance of this. But when he's been a saint for quite a long time. I'm assuming going back into the medieval area, but I really don't know the answer to when he became a saint.
There's a question that came in that asks, is Putin's job in jeopardy at this point in time?
So this is really interesting now in talking about the war. Well, who knows, of course, right? But certainly things aren't going well, and he really is cornered. Putin never expected this to happen. I mean, here we are. Where are we? 9 months, 8 months later, 7 months later, and they're bogged down. They've lost territory. This was supposed to be a win. When Putin took over Crimea, and I'm going to do the long answer. When Putin took over Crimea in 2014, the sanctions were very, very few. It passed. He figured, all right, that was fine. The West didn't come together when the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in the Eastern territories were created. Yes, Khrushchev was Ukrainian. And I saw the chat and I digressed. Sorry, I got distracted. Shiny things, what can I say? So, but essentially, so in 2014, 2015, the West did not unite. Putin felt really comfortable. He was still on top of his game. He was still, the Russian economy was still doing just fine. By 2016, he's concentrating, mid 13th century, there you go. He's I knew it was medieval, I just didn't know when. He's consecrating Volodymyr is a Russian, is a, a statue. And by the way, when they consecrate these statues, this is a big deal when you have the patriarch there. And still, but he's riding high, and he's still warning the West, don't expand eastward. There are consequences, but there are no sanctions. The pipeline, the flow of oil and gas, everything's going. No one's being sanctioned and cut off and restricted in terms of international travel. And so when President Zelensky comes into power in 2019 with a pro-Western attitude, and Putin at that point sees it as, well, you know what? The West isn't going to come together. I'm going to do what I want, and they're not going to want to do anything here. And so the invasion, and I think, and I know he's shocked, and so are his generals shocked by what happens. Although his generals had been warning that we should have invaded not just Crimea, but we should have invaded Ukraine right after Crimea, when before the Ukrainians would have a chance to develop their armed forces and what have you. So that didn't happen. Many, from what I've been reading, generals are saying it was a lost opportunity for the Russians. But by the time we get into the invasion now, 7 months later, the West is united. Sure, the petrodollars are still coming in, but even now, China and India are beginning to, put brakes, but still, there's petrodollars coming in. But the Russian economy, short term was doing fine, but right now, long term, how long can it continue to do fine as consumer goods shortages emerge? We saw what happened now with the he called the partial mobilization of Russian forces. Russians are fleeing Russia, who have the means to flee. They're flying out. There's huge traffic jams at the borders. They're going into Europe. They're going into Turkey, where they don't need visas, and they are fleeing so that their sons and themselves will not be conscripted. There are just today, someone shot up a recruitment area. I just read it quickly before coming online for this, and a Russian commander was either killed or severely wounded. You're seeing protests throughout Russia. You're seeing repression emerge. So the sort of Russian home front that was well, this is going on in Ukraine now, and the example of Afghanistan is not to be lost, where when the body bags of Russian troops are coming home in the 80s, strains began to emerge in Russian society, and those strains, as this war continues, we don't know where those strains will happen. What happens if Putin closes the border? The Russian embassy just yesterday, the U.S. embassy just yesterday issued an alert. It was either yesterday or this morning, I've lost track of time, saying, urging all U.S. nationals to leave Russia immediately. And that includes, Russian nationals with dual citizenship, Russian and U.S. passports, because the U.S. side of that dual citizenship, they fear from examples already will not be honored, and the potential for conscription is great. And so this mobilization means that they're going to attempt, I don't know what they think they're going to do with trying to get 300,000 troops. They need to be trained, they need to be armed and equipped, and then sent to the front. And what we've seen so far, troops who don't want to fight and who don't want to fight for an elitist nationalist cause that has nothing to do with them, usually won't fight that well. And it doesn't mean much for morale that's already suffering amongst Russian troops as it is. Again, there's different segments of the Russian forces, but at this point, Putin is in trouble. And what happens already, we've seen some municipalities, we've seen some leaders in the Russian Duma, the Russian legislative branch, who are supportive of Putin, but who already are saying, look, this mobilization is being handled wrongly. It's being botched. So if you begin to see these fissures emerge already amongst some of the elite, as well as society beginning to fracture, I don't know where it'll go, but if Russia closes its borders, and I don't know that that'll happen, to keep people in, then that could add to the pressure cooker. So I think it's a pressure cooker, and and we don't know. The thing with pressure cookers, it takes time for the steam to build until it pops off. We saw that in the late 80s and early 90s. So I don't know if that's a good answer to your question, but it's the best I have.
That was a great answer. We have a bunch of questions that have come in. So one was someone they wanted to say first that it's a pleasure to be here and to listen to you, and the historical context is essential to understand what is going on in Ukraine today. But they asked, do you think that the EU will accept Ukraine's request to be a member? If so, how do you think Russia will react?
Yeah, I wish I had a crystal ball, but I mean, I can't prognosticate. However, at this point, Putin had been threatening the invasion of any country, I mean, the invasion military action against Ukraine if it were to join NATO. And in the late 2000s, the Ukraine in 2008, 2009 had signed some preliminary agreements to become like a candidate status for the EU. And it was like Georgia, actually. It became part of a country who was beginning the process to join the EU through economic and trade development. So, and Putin threatened back then, and nothing happened. It was put on the side burner. But now the threat of military action, it's happened. It's there's a full-scale war going on. And so my sense of it is that as long as the EU stays and NATO stays together on this, and so far they seem to be, just this week there was a conference actually in Kyiv with many of the top academics and figures talking just about what's been happening and what could happen. And from what I gleaned of it, I was watching it and streaming, and well, no, on YouTube, not streaming because of the time difference. Is my sense is that what could very well happen is that once this war ends, and that's the big question: how is the war going to end? As part of that, could it be that for Russian security concerns, could it be that part of the deal will be that Ukraine will not join the EU and not join NATO? I don't know. It all depends how this war ends. It really does. Right now, if the arms that continue to flow, if the sophisticated arms from the West continue to flow into the Ukrainian military, which has taken on a NATO model, frankly, and if tanks, I mean, they're asking for the M1 Abrams tanks, but if tanks, more sophisticated tanks, begin to enter into Ukraine, which is really important, not for the northern forested areas where Kharkiv is, but for the central southern areas where you have the steppelands, the flatlands, where sophisticated tanks and powerful tanks would be needed by the Ukrainian military. So if that continues, and if there is a military conclusion, and I don't know this would be the case, but that favors Ukraine, which a few months ago everyone was scoffing at the idea, but who knows? Then the peace could be something else. So it all depends on how this is resolved. But with the fact that we have a war going on right now, that was the threat that Putin had, my sense would be that it would join the EU and NATO frankly, to prevent this from happening again. But again, it all depends on what happen, how it all ends.
I want to be able to get to everyone's question. There was one that just came in. It was like kind of maybe related to the idea of like a conclusion or something, but is Putin's threat of the use of nuclear arms real or a bluff, do you think?
You know, my contacts in the Kremlin are drying up, but I can say this. You know, I was watching an interview with the Finnish president, and the Finnish president, again, Finland had been non-aligned like Sweden since the war, right? And they said, nope, no more non-aligned. We can't trust Putin. And what the Finnish president had said, hopefully that Putin would realize that if he uses even tactical nuclear weapons, that the support that is dwindling, but is still there from China and India, could very well vanish. Because to use tactical nuclear weapons, or worse, in Ukraine, would make Russia a true pariah state, being the only country since World War II to do so, and in the modern age, and it would just cross a line that has never been crossed, even in the height of the Cold War. In the height of the Cold War, with the hot war in Afghanistan, with the U.S., again, there's a lot of folly in U.S. policy in Afghanistan in the 80s, but in its partnership with Saudi Arabia, that you could say helped create the mess of Afghanistan that came later, but that's another story, another discussion. But you know, the U.S. was sending in money and arms to the Mujahideen in Afghanistan and in the 80s, and it was a proxy war, but no talk of nuclear at all. The same in the proxy war when the U.S. in Vietnam. The same. Oh, sure, you might have some generals once in a while that mouthed off, but at no point was there any discussion. So the fact that Medvedev, the vice president, just the other day, Putin's vice president, said in a public statement to the Ukrainians, he said, Ukraine, don't think NATO and the EU will come to your aid if we use nuclear weapons. They won't. You're on your own. So for him to say that has to put you into what is the mindset. And you know, and also the Finnish president had said, and that could be that the pandemic of the past several years, because Putin really has isolated himself, has significantly closed them off, too much so, believing his own rhetoric, to the point where Putin is navigating the forces into Ukraine, which is ridiculous by any military strategy. So would they use tactical nuclear weapons? I wouldn't put it past them at this point, because all sanity has been put out the window as far as I can see. Why did Putin invade? The Russian economy was fine. You know, Russians were traveling around the world. You know, Russia was, you know, now why do this? Because he didn't expect it to happen, number one. He didn't expect the consequences. And now that the consequences have happened, you have essentially a situation where he has to have an ability to save face. But there's no ability to save face right now. And so when cornered, what could happen? I don't know. There are other players in the Russian military command when it comes to nuclear weapons. What will happen to those players? At some point, will Putin lose the elite? Right now, it doesn't seem so. But so I'm fearful for the worst, but hoping that some sanity will prevail in some circles. It's the best I can do for Nancy.
I hope so too. Are you able to take a couple
Say it again?
more?
I can't hear you.
Oh, my internet connection, I think, is unstable. Is that better?
Yeah, I can hear you better.
Okay, yeah, I think my connection is just a little off right now.
Yeah, if there are more questions, I'm ready, or discussion or
Yeah,
whatever.
that somebody had asked was, it was a two-part question. Was Khrushchev Ukrainian, and did the Soviet government recognize Ukraine as a separate nation like Kazakhstan, or just a name?
So yeah,
only?
if I remember correctly, Khrushchev was from Ukraine, if I remember correctly, as I thought Gorbachev was. But Ukraine, like Kazakhstan, like Kyrgyzstan, like Lithuania, Estonia, Latvia, were autonomous republics. The Soviet Socialist Republics, if I recall, was the phrase. I used to know that right off the bat. But so it was an autonomous republic, but autonomous as long as it conformed to the Moscow's line. And so, yes, they were never independent republics. There was always the Communist Party of the Soviet Union secretary in the capitals, and so whenever the political leadership of the Kazakhs or of the Ukrainians made a decision, they had to make sure that they passed it by the party secretary from Moscow. And sometimes could be a Kazakh, could be obviously a Ukrainian, but was the party secretary from Moscow. And so nothing was done. Again, the Soviet Union was an incredibly centralized state. Putin has, over the past 22 years, returned to that centralization. As he went from democratically elected president to essentially authoritarian ruler, eliminating the free press, eliminating many freedoms, and eliminating opposition through outright death and alleged murders to imprisonment, like Navalny, who's in prison in one of the gulags, one of the concentration camps, labor camps right now. And we've been seeing various industrialists and billionaires drop off like flies. Any opposition to Putin seems to result in either arrest, exile, or mysterious death. So yes, Ukraine was an autonomous republic, but that autonomy should always be in quotation marks, had to be in line with Moscow.
Maybe we can take like one more question. There's so many. Sorry. Let's see. Let's go with the one that was after the rise of the Romanov dynasty. What was the extent of the interaction with the land of what is now Ukraine? And that can be our last question.
All right. Can you say that again one more time?
Yeah, sorry, my internet connection is a little unstable, I guess. After the rise of the Romanov dynasty, what was the extent of the interaction with the land of what is now Ukraine?
So by the 18th century, under Catherine the Great, of course, the Russian Empire expands to absorb what is Ukraine now, and it would become part of all the Russias. And again, the history of Russia here, Russia, the idea of Russia begins to emerge with Ivan IV, often referred to as Ivan Grozny, Ivan the Terrible. And when he takes on the title of Tsar, and his father, Ivan III, again, back in the 15th century, as the Roman Empire, as the Byzantine Empire, the Eastern Roman Empire, later historians in the 18th century will call it Byzantine, but for their purposes, they always were Romans right up to the last Roman Emperor, Constantine XI, died in the siege of Constantinople when the Ottoman Turks took it over in 1453. But in the late 1450s, 1460s, anyway, late 15th century, Ivan III will marry, I think it was Sophia Palaiologos, who was the niece of the last Roman emperor. And it's there that the trappings of the double of the imperial state will transfer, if you would, up to Moscow. And then we'll see the emergence of the double-headed eagle and of the title, not just the Grand Dukes of Muscovy, but the title of Tsar. And Tsar means Caesar. Tsar is the Russian for Caesar. And so by the time, of course, Ivan IV will take that title of Caesar of all the Russias as Muscovy is expanding southward and eastward. And then, of course, he'll die. There'll be a time of troubles for a while. And by 1613, 1615, Michael will emerge and the Romanov dynasty will be founded. But when the Romanovs are founded, they are Tsars of all the Russias with the double-headed eagle that now, of course, we can see once again, in Russia today. And as it will expand over time, right? Peter the Great will want to expand westward. He'll attempt to and will expand southward to a degree. Catherine the Great will continue that expansion. The Cossacks will emerge for a little while in the 17th and 18th century as a proto-Ukrainian state. They'll be absorbed into Russia, as it were, in late 18th into the 19th century, and the question was, what happens to the territory? So the territory is absorbed by Russia and becomes part of the Russian Empire, and particularly by the time of Catherine the Great and into the early 19th century. And wanting to maintain the integrity of the Russian Empire and the territory of what is Ukraine in Russia in the 19th century, of course, that's when I think it was Alexander the Third. Anyway, that's when the Russian emperor will, in the 1860s, I believe it was, will outlaw Ukrainian language and culture as an attempt to try and crush and repress Ukrainian national identity. Because remember, the 19th century was a century of nationalism. So in the 19th century, the Bulgars, the Greeks, the Serbs, the Romanian, they all were rising up against the Habsburgs or the Ottomans, and with their wars of independence. And so there was a great fear of that. So anyway, so I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And I mean, you gave us a huge overview in just a little over an hour tonight, and I really appreciate it. I'll send out a recap after this program, and I'll list those books that you mentioned in the beginning slide. I also recorded this program, and it'll be on the library's YouTube channel. Thank you so much, David. This was fascinating and a great overview.
All right, it's the historical context that I promised and tried to do. So thank you very much, and let's really hope for the best for the future. These are very dark times we're in right now, and really let us hope for the best, and for those defending their homeland in Ukraine. Let us really hope and pray for them. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you for contributing to the discussion. Thank you again, David. Have a good night.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Matthew. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you.